They ended it calmly. No tears, no long conversation, no dramatic goodbye, just clarity, or what looked like clarity. They said they needed space, said it wasn't working, said it was better this way. And then they were fine, at least on the surface. While you were replaying everything, they seemed settled, composed, resolved. And that's the part that haunted you. How can someone walk away so cleanly? How can attachment just switch off? Here's the uncomfortable truth. For many avoidant nervous systems, closure is not resolution. It's compartmentalization. Most people imagine closure as emotional completion, grief processed, lessons integrated, attachment released. But for an avoidant structure, ending something does not require full emotional digestion. It requires containment. Avoidant attachment develops in environments where emotional overwhelm was not safely held. So instead of learning to process feelings through expression and co-regulation, the system learned to manage them through internal shelving. Shelving is different from healing. Shelving says, "This is too activating right now. I'll put it away." And when a relationship ends, especially one that required vulnerability, activation spikes. Loss activates attachment. Attachment activates fear. Fear activates vulnerability. And vulnerability activates old memory. For someone who equates vulnerability with loss of control, the nervous system moves fast, not toward grief, toward containment. You may cry for weeks. They may appear fine in days, not because the bond meant less, but because their system moved it into a compartment, neatly, efficiently, out of sight, but not dissolved. Let's understand the mechanism. Compartmentalization is a dissociative strategy. It allows conflicting emotional experiences to exist separately, without integration. They can say, "I care about you," and also, "I'm done," without feeling the full tension between those statements. Because the emotional charge is not fully online. It has been muted, not erased. Muted. This is why avoidant breakups often feel abrupt. There may have been internal dissatisfaction for months, but instead of processing it relationally, they process it privately, in fragments. Small irritations get stored. Unspoken disappointments get stored. Moments of disconnection get stored. Until one day, the shelf feels full. And instead of gradual confrontation, there is decisive withdrawal. It looks sudden. It rarely is. The emotional processing did not happen with you. It happened in isolation. But even then, it was partial, because isolation limits depth. True resolution requires integration. Integration requires feeling. Feeling requires staying present with discomfort, and presence under emotional intensity is precisely what avoidance systems struggle with most. So instead of integrating the loss, they reorganize around it. Reorganization is behavioral. Integration is emotional. They may restructure routines quickly, change environments, immerse in work, travel, date, distract. From the outside, it looks like moving on. Internally, it is often emotional shelving. There is a critical distinction here. Avoidants do not lack attachment. They regulate attachment differently. When a bond threatens autonomy or activates engulfment fear, their system begins deactivating strategies, focusing on flaws, minimizing intimacy, highlighting incompatibilities, reframing memories. This cognitive distancing reduces emotional intensity. By the time the breakup happens, they have already rehearsed separation. Internally, you are grieving the present. They are executing a decision their nervous system began preparing for earlier. But preparation is not processing. It is bracing. And bracing feels like certainty. You interpret their calm as clarity. Sometimes it is relief from tension. Relief is not the same as resolution. Relief says, the pressure is gone. Resolution says, I have fully metabolized the experience. Those are different states. Many avoidants experience initial relief. After a breakup, relief from emotional demand, relief from perceived expectation, relief from vulnerability exposure. That relief can mask grief for a while, but grief that is shelved does not disappear. It waits. It resurfaces in quiet moments, in new relationships, in unexpected triggers, in nostalgia waves. They don't fully understand. This is why clean breaks with avoidance can feel confusing. They don't always circle back immediately, but they often carry unfinished emotion longer than they admit. Because shelving prevents integration, it does not eliminate imprint. There's another layer: identity preservation. Avoidant structures rely heavily on self-sufficiency identity. I don't need much. I'm independent. I'm fine alone. A breakup threatens attachment, but it also reinforces autonomy, which can strengthen identity. So instead of collapsing into visible grief, they double down on independence. The narrative becomes, this was the right decision, even if part of them still feels the loss. Narratives protect coherence, and coherence protects stability. But stability built on compartmentalization is fragile because suppressed emotion does not integrate into wisdom. It lingers as tension. This is why some avoidants seem emotionally unaffected until much later, months, sometimes years, when another attachment activates similar wounds, or when life slows down enough. That distraction weakens. Then the shelf cracks. Memories surface with intensity they didn't expect, because emotional time was paused, not processed. Closure in secure attachment is gradual integration. It is reflection, responsibility, meaning-making, emotional digestion. Closure in avoidant structures is often structural separation. Cut contact, shift focus, reclaim autonomy, contain feeling. One is metabolizing, the other is organizing. You may crave answers, crave a final conversation, crave emotional acknowledgement. That matches your depth. But if their system has shelved the experience, accessing full emotional articulation may not be immediately possible, not because they are heartless, but because integration requires tolerating activation, and activation triggers shutdown. So the myth of avoidant closure is this: that they feel less. More often, they feel differently, and process differently, and delay differently. What looks like a clean ending is often a closed drawer, and closed drawers can be reopened. The question is not whether they ever feel it. The question is when and under what conditions. Because emotional shelving is efficient in the short term, but incomplete in the long term. And incomplete processing always leaves residue. Residue shows up later in ways that surprise both of you. There is something deeply unsettling about watching someone walk away without visible grief. It makes you question the bond. It makes you question your significance. It makes you question reality. Because in your body, attachment feels seismic, disorienting, heavy, unavoidable. So when they appear steady, your mind searches for meaning. They never cared. It wasn't real. I imagined it. But what you are witnessing is not the absence of attachment. It is emotional shelving in action. Let's go deeper into that mechanism. When an avoidant nervous system detects overwhelming attachment activation, It does not lean into process. It deactivates. Deactivation strategies are subtle. They minimize emotional memory. They emphasize incompatibility. They focus on independence. They cognitively reframe intimacy as restriction. This creates internal distance. Distance reduces activation. Reduced activation feels like clarity, but clarity reached through suppression is fragile because suppression requires maintenance. Imagine placing something heavy into a drawer and forcing it shut. It stays closed as long as pressure is applied. Remove the pressure, and it shifts. Avoidant closure works the same way. It holds as long as distraction, routine, and autonomy remain strong. But attachment does not dissolve. Because distance exists, attachment dissolves through integration, and integration requires revisiting emotion with openness. That is the part often skipped. There is also a timing difference. That creates confusion. Anxious attachment processes loss immediately. Emotion rises fast. Grief floods early. Rumination intensifies. Avoidant attachment delays. First comes relief, then restructuring, then distraction, only later. If the system feels safe enough, does deeper emotion surface? This delay can create the illusion that they moved on easily, but delayed grief is still grief. It just arrives quietly and often alone. Here's another part most people miss. Avoidants frequently begin detaching before the official breakup, not consciously plotting, but gradually withdrawing emotionally. When vulnerability feels too exposing, they may sense increasing dependency, increasing emotional expectation, increasing relational demand, and instead of addressing it openly, their system begins bracing. Bracing looks like subtle distancing, less initiation, less emotional depth, more focus on flaws, more emphasis on independence. By the time they end it, part of them has already rehearsed separation. You are shocked. They are executing. But execution is not resolution. It is culmination of avoidance. The emotional energy that would have gone into repair went into detachment instead. So when the breakup happens, their nervous system feels organized. Organized does not mean healed. It means compartmentalized. Let's talk about emotional memory. Even when feelings are shelved, the body retains imprint. Places, songs, smells, routines. Attachment experiences encode somatically. They do not disappear because a decision was made. This is why avoidants sometimes experience unexpected waves of nostalgia, not romantic fantasy, but emotional flashes, moments of softness, moments of missing. They may quickly suppress these flashes, but suppression requires effort, and effort reveals presence. There's also identity protection at play. If their self-concept centers on independence, needing someone deeply threatens that identity. So after a breakup, doubling down on autonomy restores psychological balance. I'm fine alone. I prefer space. I work better independently. These statements may feel true, and partially they are, but sometimes they are also armor. Armor that protects against acknowledging how much the bond actually mattered. Because acknowledging depth means acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability reactivates fear. Fear of engulfment, fear of loss, fear of emotional overwhelm. So the system maintains the shelf. Another important distinction: avoidant closure often prioritizes narrative closure over emotional closure. They want a logical reason, a clear explanation, a contained story. This wasn't compatible. We wanted different things. It wasn't sustainable long term. Logical coherence reduces ambiguity. Ambiguity increases attachment activation. So if the story feels complete, the nervous system can rest, even if the heart is not fully processed. Narrative completion can mask emotional incompletion. That's why post-breakup conversations with avoidance often feel clean, structured, rational. They answer questions calmly. They may even reassure you in abstract terms, but you don't feel depth because depth is not fully accessible, while compartmentalization is active. Now, here is where the myth becomes dangerous. Many people wait for the avoidant to come back when they realize. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Emotional shelving does not guarantee return, it guarantees delayed processing. Delayed processing can lead to clarity or to reinforcement of independence. It depends on whether the person is willing to examine their own defenses. If they are self-aware, they may eventually recognize that relief was not resolution. That distance was not healing. That detachment was protection. If they are not self-aware, they may continue repeating the cycle. In future relationships, detach when vulnerable, shelf when overwhelmed, leave when activation peaks. Repeat. Avoidant closure is a myth, not because they never feel, but because the appearance of finality is often structural, not emotional. Structural endings look decisive. Emotional endings feel integrated. You can end something structurally while still carrying emotional imprint. An imprint shapes future behavior. This is why some avoidants reappear months later with unexpected intensity, not because they were secretly plotting, but because the shelf weakened. Life slowed down. Another attachment failed. Loneliness surfaced, or they simply matured enough to revisit the compartment. When that happens, they may genuinely believe they've realized something new. In reality, they are accessing what was paused. Paused emotion is not dead emotion. It is deferred, and deferred emotion often resurfaces when the nervous system feels safer than it did during the breakup. But safety varies, which is why timing varies. The myth says they moved on cleanly. The psychology says they reorganized quickly. Reorganization is visible. Integration is slower, and integration leaves depth. So if you are measuring your worth against their composure, understand this. Composure after separation does not equal absence of attachment. It often equals compartmentalization, paired with relief. Relief from activation is powerful, but relief fades, and what remains is whatever was never fully processed. The question is not whether they feel later. The question is whether they have the capacity to integrate what they feel instead of shelving it again. That capacity determines whether patterns repeat or evolve, and that difference is the real closure. There's a moment most people never see. It doesn't happen during the breakup. It doesn't happen in the first weeks after. It happens later, quietly, when distraction loses its edge, when independence feels normal again, when the nervous system is no longer in acute defense. That's when the shelf creaks. Because compartmentalization is not deletion, it is storage, and storage has weight. Now we need to go deeper, because the real question isn't whether avoidants feel, it's how their inner architecture is built. This identity feels strong, independent, resilient, but underneath it is a nervous system trained to downregulate vulnerability quickly. When attachment intensity rises, the system searches for control. Control comes through distance. Distance reduces stimulation. Reduced stimulation creates calm. Calm feels like clarity, but calm achieved through deactivation is not integration. It is containment. And containment creates compartments. Imagine a mental filing cabinet. One drawer labeled relationship, another labeled work, another labeled family, another labeled self. When a breakup occurs, the relationship drawer is closed, locked, filed away. The rest of life continues. Functioning remains intact. Daily routines are not interrupted. Productivity may even increase because activation energy is no longer flooding the system. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like order restored. But here's the complication. Attachment memory doesn't stay in its assigned drawer. It leaks through subtle triggers, through dreams, through comparisons, through sudden emotional flashes. These flashes are often brief, quickly dismissed, rationalized, shelved again. But every time they resurface, they reveal something important. The bond was real. Now let's examine the concept of resolution. True resolution requires three elements: emotional acknowledgement, narrative understanding, physiological integration. Avoidant closure often completes the second one. Narrative understanding. They can explain why it ended. They can articulate incompatibilities. They can list reasons. But emotional acknowledgement may remain partial, and physiological integration may remain incomplete. Physiological integration means the body has processed the attachment rupture. There is no lingering hyperactivation, no suppressed grief, no subtle contraction. When thinking about the person, that level of processing takes vulnerability, and vulnerability requires tolerating activation without fleeing. For someone wired toward deactivation, this is uncomfortable territory. So instead of integration, the system chooses containment. Containment works until it doesn't. This is why some avoidants experience sudden, late waves of grief. Months later, sometimes years later, triggered by a new relationship reaching similar depth, a life transition, a moment of loneliness, or simply maturation. When emotional capacity expands, old compartments open. What was once intolerable becomes accessible. But here is the truth many people don't want to hear. Even when avoidants revisit old emotions, it does not automatically mean reconciliation. Processing does not equal return. Sometimes integration leads to gratitude and release. Sometimes it leads to regret. Sometimes it leads to growth. In future relationships, the myth of avoidant closure isn't about guaranteed comeback. It's about misunderstanding, timing, and mechanism. Another layer we need to explore: shame. Avoidance systems often carry quiet shame around emotional needs. Needing someone deeply can feel destabilizing. After a breakup, acknowledging grief may feel like confirming that dependence existed, and dependence contradicts their self concept. So grief is minimized, not because it's absent, but because it conflicts with identity. Identity preservation is powerful. People will protect identity, even at the cost of emotional truth. Now let's look at how this affects you. When you experience open grief, and they appear composed, your nervous system interprets it as imbalance. I'm the only one hurting. I cared more. I meant less. But emotional expression styles are not accurate measures of attachment depth. They are measures of regulation strategy. Anxious systems externalize distress. Avoidance systems internalize and suppress distress. Secure systems process and integrate distress. Different wiring, different visibility, same human capacity for attachment. The tragedy happens when visibility is mistaken for depth, or when calmness is mistaken for closure. You may crave signs that they miss you, that they're affected, that the bond mattered. But if their coping style is compartmentalization, you won't see that evidence. In obvious ways, you might see it in indirect behaviors, checking indirectly, lingering in digital proximity, slow reappearances, unfinished conversations resurfacing, or complete silence paired with later emotional intensity. But here's the shift we need to make. The goal is not to decode whether they secretly feel. The goal is to understand what type of processing they are capable of. Capability determines relational future. Someone can feel deeply and still lack integration skills. Someone can miss you and still avoid vulnerability. Someone can regret and still repeat patterns. Emotional shelving becomes a cycle when it is never examined. Examine means recognizing deactivation patterns, allowing grief without shame, staying present with discomfort, not fleeing at the first surge of vulnerability. This is advanced emotional work. Not everyone chooses it, which is why avoidant closure often looks final, because facing internal compartments requires courage. Now let's address something else. Sometimes avoidants truly believe they are done. In that moment, they are, because the shelf is sealed and their subjective experience feels complete. But subjective completion, based on suppression, is conditional. It depends on continued avoidance of triggers. The moment vulnerability re-enters their life in similar intensity, the old blueprint activates, and unprocessed emotions may surface. That's when confusion happens. For some reason, I can't stop thinking about you. It hit me later. I didn't realize how much it mattered. These statements are not manipulation by default. They are often delayed awareness. Awareness expands when defenses relax. But again, awareness does not guarantee action. Integration requires sustained openness. Now we need to talk about permanence. Closure myths promise finality. Psychology deals in processes. Avoidant attachment does not eliminate bonds quickly. It reorganizes them internally. Reorganization can look like erasure, but it is more like archiving. Archived files can be reopened or left untouched. It depends on growth trajectory. So when someone tells you they moved on so easily, the deeper question is, did they integrate or did they compartmentalize? The difference is invisible. In the short term, it reveals itself over time, through emotional depth, in future relationships, through pattern repetition, through self-awareness, through willingness to stay present. When intimacy rises again, and this is where power shifts back to you, because whether they shelved or integrated does not change. What you require for safety, understanding their psychology, brings clarity. But clarity is not an invitation to wait indefinitely. Closure for you cannot depend on whether their shelf eventually opens. Your closure must come from integration on your side, feeling the grief, understanding the dynamic, recognizing patterns, reclaiming self-trust. Because while they may compartmentalize, you are allowed to metabolize. Metabolizing emotion creates resilience. Shelving emotion preserves fragility. Now we move to the final layer. Not about them, but about what closure truly means, and why the clean break fantasy often distracts from the deeper work. Both sides must face. Closure is not an event. It is a process, and most people are chasing the wrong version of it. You were taught that closure is a conversation, a final talk, a clear explanation, a clean emotional ending. But real closure is integration, not agreement, not apology, not mutual peace. Integration. And integration does not require two people. It requires one nervous system. willing to feel what happened without fragmenting. Avoidant closure is a myth because it confuses decision with digestion. A decision can be instant. Digestion takes time. A decision is cognitive. Digestion is emotional and physiological. You can decide something is over while your body is still attached. You can walk away calmly while parts of you are frozen in the bond. That freeze is what people mistake for strength. But freeze is not resolution. It is suspended processing. And suspended processing always demands energy to maintain. Energy that could have gone into growth, into repair, into expansion. Instead, it goes into containment. Now here is the deeper truth. Some avoidants eventually integrate. They mature. They confront their compartments. They revisit the grief. They feel what they avoided. And when they do, it changes them. Not because they lost you, but because they finally met themselves. Others continue shelving, continue organizing their lives around independence. That feels clean, but lacks depth. And from the outside, you will not immediately know which path they chose. That uncertainty can keep you hooked, waiting, scanning for signs, looking for proof that the bond meant something. But your healing cannot be conditional on their timing. Closure is not something they grant you. It is something you create. And here is where power shifts. When you stop chasing explanation and start integrating experience, your nervous system stabilizes. You no longer need their reaction to validate your reality. You no longer measure your worth by how composed they looked. You understand this. Emotional shelving is not emotional superiority. Calm exits are not always healed exits. And silence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of strategy. But strategy does not equal capacity. Capacity is proven in future intimacy, in future vulnerability, in whether they can stay present when attachment activates again. That is where real growth shows, not in how cleanly someone leaves. Now let's bring this home. If someone walked away calmly while you were unraveling, it does not mean you loved more. It means you processed differently. If they appeared untouched, it does not mean you were forgettable. It means their nervous system prioritized containment. Containment protects. Integration transforms. And transformation is slower, but stronger. You don't need to prove that they will feel it later. You don't need to wait for delayed realization. You don't need to monitor their healing. Your task is different. Feel fully. Understand patterns. Refuse to internalize their defense as your deficiency. Because here's the paradox. The person who integrates often grows faster than the person who shelves. Pain processed becomes wisdom. Pain avoided becomes repetition. So the myth is not that avoidants feel nothing. The myth is that looking composed means it's finished. Some endings are quiet, but quiet does not mean complete. And if this breakdown shifted something for you, if it clarified confusion or challenged assumptions, stay with this work. Subscribe, engage, build literacy around attachment, because understanding patterns is how cycles end. And if this resonated, leave a comment with one word: integrated, if you're choosing to process, or shelved, if you've seen this pattern clearly now. Not for them, for you. Because closure isn't about who leaves cleaner. It's about who grows deeper. And depth always wins over distance.